Welcome to Shing Digital's webinar series. This first video is going to be about why you need to care about cybersecurity and what are the essential cyber defenses that you need for your organization. Before we move on to the cyber defenses, let's talk a little bit about the threats that are out there. The top three attack types, as recorded by IBM Security X-Force, is about 21% of all of the attacks that were recorded were from ransomware. 14% of those attacks were against server access, and 8% of those attacks was a business email compromise, which is tied with data theft. And the top three attack vectors of how some of these are launched is number one is phishing at 43%, followed by the exploitation of vulnerabilities, and lastly, stolen credentials. I used to get asked all the time, what's in it for the hackers? Why are they doing what they're doing? And it's all about the money. Now, in 2019, the worldwide cybercrime revenue was estimated to be at $1.6 trillion. Now, to put that into perspective, Canada's entire GDP is $1.6 trillion. And now, to make things even scarier, in 2020, that estimate was $4 trillion of worldwide revenue for the bad guys. And in 2021, the estimates were coming in at $6 trillion. If that doesn't give you an idea of why they are motivated to attack your networks, this should make it clear. If the worldwide numbers don't resonate as much, here are some stats from the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. In Canada, the average cost of a data breach is $6.35 million. And in 58% of those breaches, they involve personal data or PII. And when personal data is involved, you could potentially be fined up to $100,000 per record that you lose. And in Canada, the average life cycle of a breach was 226 days from infiltration to containment. It takes on average 168 days to identify the threat and 58 days to contain the threat. Now that's a total of 226 days that the bad guys are in your network. In comparison, the worldwide average is 288 days. So we're doing a little bit better than the worldwide average. Amongst all the cyber threats, the one that probably keeps the IT managers awake at night and probably your insurance underwriter is ransomware. The good news, the average 2021 payout was down about $25,000 from 2020. The bad news is it's still 183,000 higher than it was in Q1 of 2019. So how are Canadian industries faring against all of these cyber threats and cyber attacks, and where does your organization rank? Well, based on 1,200 attacks identified by NordLocker, the construction industry is the most targeted, followed by manufacturing and then finance. After that, healthcare through to government are all fairly close. Globally, finance is the most targeted industry, followed by manufacturing and then energy. Now, after all of those stats, if you still want to stay on the internet, and I assume that you do, let's talk about how to keep you protected. I like to start from working my way from the internet and work my way down through the infrastructure stack of your organization. To start off, let's talk about email protection. Regular anti-spam, anti-phishing, and antivirus are no longer enough. Since 94% of malware is delivered via email, and phishing is the number one attack vector, advanced email protection is a must. And here are the features that you're going to want to look for in an advanced email protection system. The first one is attachment sandboxing. Now, this feature may be called different names, but essentially what it does is it takes an unknown attachment and opens it up in an isolated environment to test it for malicious behavior. This strategy can protect against zero-day malware that would easily bypass normal scans. The next feature is URL protection. Again, it can have different names from different providers, but what this feature does is it puts a wrapper around any URL that is embedded into the emails. If a URL is ever detected to be malicious, the service will prevent your users from accessing that website. Since the wrapper is always there in the email, the protection will also stay in place for as long as you continue to have the service. Now, the third feature to look for is anti-impersonation. Now, this feature isn't quite as common, and it's probably also the least reliable of the three, but any protection that it provides is better than none. What this feature tries to do is it tries to detect if a bad actor is trying to impersonate somebody from your organization, not using a forged email address, but using a forged name, which is very difficult for many systems to be able to detect. Hence, also the reason why it's also the least reliable. But again, any protection from this perspective is better than none. Moving from the internet to the network edge, the next line of defense is going to be your firewall. Just like email protection, traditional firewalls are no longer enough to protect your network. A next generation firewall is a must. Now, what is a next gen firewall? Well, a next gen firewall provides a unified threat management stack. It inspects all of the traffic that goes through it, and it scans it for malware. It looks for websites that could attack your users, and it protects against vulnerability attacks against your users and your servers and the rest of your infrastructure. And lastly on my list is the sandboxing of unknown downloads. Now, modern next generation firewalls will have a lot more features than this, but these are the basics of what every next generation firewall must have. Now, the best analogy I like to draw between a traditional firewall and a next generation firewall is like the gates that protect a castle. A traditional firewall lets people come and go if they scan the right credentials at the gate. A next generation firewall is like putting security guards and guard dogs there to make sure that nothing is being smuggled in that shouldn't be coming in. The next topic, multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, transcends locations and is about how to protect your users' logins to the organization's digital assets. And by digital assets, I mean cloud assets such as Office 365, Salesforce, Oracle, SAP, or even to your website. The next is VPNs, which provide a gateway into your network from anywhere on the internet. Definitely needs to be protected. And computer logins are just some of your digital assets. Now, the reason for MFA is that user IDs and passwords can be easily bypassed by either stealing them by phishing, buying them on the dark web, or password spraying attacks are just some of the ways that the bad guys can get to your users' credentials. And once they have them, without MFA, there's nothing to stop them. So what is MFA? Well, MFA requires the user to perform an additional action in order to complete a login process. This makes breaking into the user account much more difficult. Not impossible, but very difficult. And that is what is at the core of cybersecurity defenses. Make life for the bad guys as hard as possible so that way they move on to an easier target, which hopefully isn't you. We talked about how traditional email protection and firewalls are no longer enough. Now let's talk about traditional or legacy anti-malware. They mainly utilize malware signatures to stop threats, but with malware that can constantly change their own code, this isn't an effective strategy anymore. The modern next-gen version of anti-malware is called endpoint detection and response. The endpoint detection portion is powered by an AI engine that will catch malware no matter how they change their code. The response portion is the actions that the AI can take to stop or isolate the threats. But even EDR needs more to deal with ever more sophisticated attacks, and that is where XDR comes in. XDR will capture, correlate, and identify sophisticated attacks that would otherwise not set off any EDR alarms. It gathers not just application behavior data, but also user behavioral data and network traffic. The AI will sort through all of that and identify the threats that need to be actioned on. But even with a sophisticated AI engine, sorting through all those findings, XDR can still generate a lot of alerts. And for most organizations, hiring a large enough team of internal security analysts to keep up with it all is generally not in the cards. And that is where a managed XDR service is a huge benefit. A great managed XDR service will have seasoned SOC analysts that can triage alerts from the AI and determine if there's a real threat, and to work with your team to contain that threat in a timely manner. and not the average of 266 days. When we think about disaster recovery, we think about backups. The problem with backups is that we tend to manage backups by exception. This means that as long as we don't get an error, we assume that everything is working fine. And that's what the bad guys are banking on, that you're not looking. This gives them a chance to manipulate your backups to give you a false sense of security that your backups are working fine, when in reality they aren't. It's important to have regular testing of your backups to make sure that they actually work and that your data is actually recoverable. And if you can augment that with automation that can perform more frequent testing and even ransomware detection, then you're at the gold standard. Now, typically, we see recovery point objectives of every 24 hours, and that's been a norm for as long as I can remember. The question for your organization is how much data is being lost for every hour or every working hour in that 1 day period? Is there a business case to be made for having an RPO of every 4 hours or two or even every hour? With the deluge of data that we generate and at the speed that we generate it at, it would be hard pressed to make a business case against more frequent backups. And it's something that you should seriously consider for your organization. The next point I have here is an air gap backup solution. Now, this didn't used to be an issue for most organizations because we used to use tapes, and tapes were always rotated in or out of the tape drive, and then they were put away in an offline location. Then we accumulated too much data, and we had to move to disk-based backup storage. This meant that backup data was online all the time, and it was great. Recovery times were lower, backups are faster. The downside is that it can also be attacked at the same time all the time. And that's why an air gap backup matters. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating that we go back to tapes, but to implement a digital air gap in your backup systems. Now, there's been a couple of vendors that have been ahead of the pack in regards to this, but we're starting to see more and more digital air gap solutions being released all the time from the vendors that haven't had it in the past. So make sure you evaluate what you have and your vendor and to make sure that they have a solution either coming up or look at changing that vendor to somebody who has that solution. Now, the last point in the deck is backing up of cloud assets. Just because your application is hosted in the cloud does not mean that it's being backed up by the provider. Make sure you ask the question, and if you don't, make sure you have a solution. The biggest one that comes to mind is Office 365. Keep in mind, Microsoft does not back up for you. They do not back up for your benefit. They back up for their benefit of their infrastructure restore, but they're not going to help you restore your data. We all do updates on our servers and computers, or at least I hope that we do. But there are a couple of important questions. The first is a two-parter. How often are you updating them, and are you prioritizing the correct security updates at the right time? The second is, are you updating everything else as well? Everything that has an IP address has software or an operating system that needs to be patched. And remember, the exploitation of vulnerabilities came in second as an infection vector of choice at 34%, right behind phishing. But the number of incidents involving exploitation of vulnerabilities rose 33% from 2020 to 2021. If you aren't patching everything with an IP address in a timely manner, you're making it easier for the bad guys to hack into your network. And they don't even need to go through the effort of phishing your users. Now, if they've already made it their way into your infrastructure, moving laterally and gaining persistence becomes even easier. This is the main reason it can take 168 days to identify an infiltration. To combat this, a vulnerability management system or a process is crucial to identifying everything that you need to patch and to prioritize which patches to apply first. At the beginning of the pandemic, most organizations were not prepared to send everyone to work from home, and a lot of compromises were made. All of the awesome infrastructure that was built on the expectations that users would be in the office was not able to keep up. The first cracks started to show in the anti-malware protection, which were mostly on-premises based. This meant that laptops that weren't connected to the VPN were not getting the latest updates. Users could go for days or weeks without updates, which left them vulnerable to attacks and attack the bad guys did. The lesson to be learned is that anti-malware, and hopefully you have or are moving to EDR, is accessible no matter where your assets are. And the easiest path to this is a cloud-based EDR solution. The other finding that's come out of the pandemic is that people aren't just working from where we thought they were. Once people realized that they were no longer tethered to the office, they became a lot more mobile and they start to work from places that we didn't expect. This manifested itself in more locations accessing our VPNs, our SaaS applications, and our VDI gateways. There's also many more devices that are connecting than we realized. The question is, who do we trust and from where do we trust them? And this is where zero trust comes in. What this means is that we don't trust any connection or any authentication on face value. We must perform additional checks to make sure that whomever is connecting is coming from a country that we approve of, a device that we approve of, and a user authentication that has been verified with MFA. Now, I'm oversimplifying it a bit, but the gist is that we don't just let anyone connect from anywhere on any device. The other hazard of our workers working from anywhere is the risk of losing any corporate assets like laptops. If you're not encrypting the storage on your laptops, you could be at risk of losing more than just the asset. Valuable data or even just digital footprints like email trails could help the bad guys to gather intelligence about the organization. Now, there are a lot of great technologies out there that can help you to encrypt and manage endpoint encryption no matter where your users want to work. The important thing to consider is the ability to centrally manage your endpoints, no matter where your users want to work from. Records management is not something that most organizations think about. With the cost of storage getting cheaper all the time, and with cloud storage being so readily available, it's simpler to just get more storage instead of managing the data. But with multi-vector attacks where ransomware also steals data, it's getting even more important not to keep all your data until the end of time. If there is a data breach, you want to limit the amount of data that is stolen because even old PII data can be used by the bad guys, or potentially if you lose it, it can be looked at as a fine for the organization. Consider only keeping data online that is necessary and to put old data into an air-gapped storage location, and only keep data for as long as necessary. These recommendations sound easy, but there's a lot of work to do behind it, and you must have a proper system in place that can automate it for you. Just like fire drills, having an incident response plan in place and practicing it is crucial to how you deal with cyber attacks. Cyber attacks will happen. It's not a matter of if, but when. Depending on the size of your organization, it doesn't have to be overly complicated. If you have even a basic plan that lays out what the staff or managers are supposed to do if they think something has happened and how they report it is better than not having a plan at all. You can certainly create more intricate plans that lays out scenarios, actions, roles, and responsibilities. And for larger organizations, you should certainly do that. But any plan is a great starting point. And like any good plan or fire drill, make sure you practice it. Have semi-annual tabletop exercises to run through a cyber attack scenario and make sure everyone knows what they're supposed to do. Minimizing the time to detect a threat and containing it can end up saving your organization. Even if you had an unlimited IT budget, it is estimated that IT can only protect an organization from 80 to 85% of the threats in the wild using technology and automation. The remaining gap has to be filled in with users. Users need to be trained on how to look out for threats and to put into practice good security behavior. More importantly, they need to understand why IT has put certain technologies into place, like MFA and like security awareness training, and why we need to keep a pulse on how that training is going with phishing and other tests. Security awareness training is the only way that we can consistently close that threat gap. The average ransomware demand is over $200,000, and the average cost of a data breach is $6.35 million. The latest statistics show that three-quarters of victims pay the ransom. What isn't recorded is the number of smaller organizations that go out of business because they can't afford to pay the ransom and they don't have the systems in place to be able to recover from the attack. And that number is probably larger than most people think. And this is where cybersecurity insurance comes in. Whether you're a small or large organization, if you're a victim of a ransomware attack or data breach, and most likely both, then cybersecurity insurance is a must. Even if you can recover your systems and your data, there are potentially fines and legal consequences that have to be considered. At a minimum, you should have a $1 million cybersecurity insurance policy. And in order to get that insurance, most insurance providers are going to be asking you if you've got your cybersecurity defenses in place. Thank you for watching this Cyber Defense Essential video. Make sure you follow the rest of this series that introduces some of the vendors that we work with in each of the areas that I just presented.